Now, deep in the British jungle.
Jesse Watson.
Hello, good folk. I wish to clarify a point which I made to a degree through my recent film, which I will mention at the end, and regarding digital ID. The point is regarding dependency and the acquisition of power through usage of dependency, through the dependence of those who you wish to hold power over. To begin, my little pony, my little pony, Arthur, good Arthur, Arthur the free, Arthur the brave, Arthur the wonder horse. Well, Arthur, I say the free, but Arthur is not entirely free. I will be brutally honest. Arthur is, you see, dependent on me. His dependency on me is the primary means by which I acquire power over him. I do my best not to abuse that power, but this is the brutal truth of it. I provide him with water. I provide him with grazing. I provide him with secure boundaries around the area within which he grazes. I provide him with security so he can sleep and not be fearful of predators. I provide him with a few tasty carrots on occasion. I provide him with scratches. All of these things mean that in Arthur's unknowable mind, nevertheless, he knows that he depends upon me. And particularly over the last few months, I've learned that I hadn't quite put it in these terms before, but the more Arthur, the presence of that reality in Arthur's mind and his enjoyment of those things, his enjoyment of my presence, his dependence upon me, which I've increased over recent months by playing with him every evening, going out and having fun with him and taking him down onto the rough land, and so he really enjoys the time he spends with me. And thus, the fact is, he becomes more dependent upon it. I have found he is, through that, becomes far more responsive in those moments where I tell him not to do something. The more he wishes to enjoy my presence, the more he cares about whether I am present, obviously, and whether he irritates me. So, having taken to, if I go out and play with him every night and give him a good scratch, a little groom, and thus he really profits from my presence, I've noticed that all it takes, if he tries to misbehave, I can simply give a little huff and walk off, and he will really take that to heart, and then I can see he will restrain that behaviour because he doesn't want me to go. Aye. So what I am trying to point you towards there, obviously, is that dependence brings power. Now, it is my very firm belief today that the major reason we have got into such a toxic state with the state, the reason the state has been allowed to become so corrupt in its dealings, so dysfunctional, so disrespectful with the people, so authoritarian, is because people have allowed themselves to become dependent upon the infrastructure and institutions that the state controls for their survival. And in that position, just as with Arthur, my pony, one is obliged to comply with the commands of someone upon whom your survival depends. So, if, for example, in the most obvious case, if one lives on money provided through the state, for the money has no state, the state has no money, but not to get into that, it's all our money. But if one is dependent upon money that the state gives you, and therefore your housing, your food, your survival is dependent upon maintaining sustaining those payments from the state, you obviously have to comply with their commands, for better or worse, whether they are in keeping with your principles or not. And the only way you can defy the commands that the state makes therein, which brings you that money, that means of survival, the only way you can defy the state, if it makes demands in that area, if it makes demands of you, is by cutting that dependency. You will lose that means of survival and have to find another. So obviously, in that position, it's very clear anyway, the vast majority are constantly being forced to do things they don't want to do. but they do them because they won't have any money if they don't do them. Now that dependency, I won't give 100 more examples, but I hope you, with a little thought, you can see that that dependency stretches across a whole myriad of areas. Now then, regarding digital ID, quite a few people I've spoken to have said we're already surveilled. The state already has all these covert powers. Digital ID doesn't really make a difference. Well, this is the difference it makes. At present, I've tried to explain this as briefly as possible. At present, as an individual, we authenticate, activate through personal interactions. We verify our identity personally with all of the various online services, which are obviously often services that move outside the online realm, such as banking. We verify all those services personally in a direct interaction with that company, body, institution, whatever. So all our social media accounts, for example, we make contact with those providers and they verify identity and activate those accounts through that direct interaction with us. So in that picture, that network, look how filthy my hands are, that network of services, be it social media, banking, online business, Amazon, whatever, eBay, blah, 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 our banking, our government services, all of those things come back to us. We are the fulcrum point, the node. We are the linchpin that activates all of those services through our direct interaction with them. Okay? Digital ID is going to change all that. Digital ID will become the means by which all these online services verify our identity. It will basically mean that the state, through that digital ID, becomes the middleman holding the means to authenticate your person, your identity, in all of those interactions with all of those services you use. In other words, it will be like the state is your mother, and she is holding your passport as a child. And so when you say to the bank that you want to take out £100, you will have to, it will happen without your knowledge, but it will happen online. I think this is what's going to, the crux of it. The message will be sent to the mothering state asking to provide your digital ID to verify that transaction. And the mother state can then either say yes or no. And that will go for all of those services online. So the state becomes the central point in that network, or they stand between you and all of those services you use. So you will thus become dependent on the state granting permission for you for all of those interactions, transactions that it carries out. So I hope you will understand that that will make you entirely dependent on the states granting that permission right across the board for all your financial transactions, for all of your social media, all of those things. Like today, when you say the online world, it's everything. As far as that's how everything in the real world is, that's how all the transactions are done. They all go through the online services. So you become entirely dependent on the state at that point. You become just like that person on benefits, relying upon the state for their survival. Even if you're a working person and you don't receive any, suddenly you are entirely dependent on the state's approval. That's where the real danger lies. That's why people are talking about the social credit score. That's the power that will allow that social credit score, etc. That's the power that that moves into the state's hands. They then have the power, basically, once they become that node point, with one flick of the switch, in the worst case scenario, with one flick of the switch there, they can potentially block all of your interactions and basically, yes, turn you off. With one flick of the switch, you can no longer access anything. If you're a little bit naughty, if you get a little bit irritating, if you're a little bit if you voice a little bit too much dissent, that's the true danger. No longer are you directly interacting with any of these service providers. The state stands in the middle. So to summarize, independence, freedom, what actually is it? What does it actually mean? It means you are not dependent. You cannot be free if you are dependent. It's the massive delusion of, and this will piss a few people off, but it's a fact, it's the massive delusion about socialism, communism, etc. That's exactly what happens. The state becomes the middleman in all interactions. The state gives you your food. The state controls everything. You become entirely dependent upon the state's approval. That's why it becomes tyrannical, why it becomes a totalitarian regime, why communism. But it's the same in a socialist society in that way. Of course, there are exceptions. But if you are dependent upon the state, if we all get universal credit when AI comes in, and we're all being paid off the state, we are all dependent on the state. So we're going to have to comply with its demands. I'm not going to do that, because that means you are not free. You become a child sat at your parents' dinner table, having to shut up and keep your mouth shut in order to get your meal served. You become a child the more dependent you are. Aye. So the message of this, well, that point about digital ID, I think I will put a link to the video I learned that from, that discusses that and a lot of other reasons why it's a bad thing. But that for me is the most significant point, that it makes the state the middleman in all your interactions and transactions, making you entirely dependent on the state's approval. That's the big change, that's the power shift. But also the deeper message I wanted to clarify in this is be very careful about making yourself dependent upon others. Because if that person is corrupt, if they don't have your best interests at heart, if you are dependent upon them, you're in big trouble. Aye. Okay, folks, with that, oh, yes, my film, The Rebel Britain Survival Guide, A Return to the Good, the True and the Beautiful. was released last weekend. I spent a year and a half making this film. It is, I can say with confidence, a beautiful work. It communicates, other than a lot of very beautiful imagery, it's very carefully crafted, and it communicates a practical philosophy for independence of mind and body, for peace of mind, for what use is freedom if one does not have peace of mind and relative content, and yes, independence from the state. And it tells the story of how I met my beautiful pony, Arthur. Full of magic, mystery and wonder. Here it is. Have a look. I think you might enjoy it. The Rebel Britain Survival Guide, a return to the good, the true and the beautiful. Thank you very much for watching. All that is left to say is, as always, stay dangerous, good people. Cheerio. Bye.